Airline sponsorship programs seem like an absolute dream come true. Your whole training paid for from start to finish, 0 hours to a full license to fly an aircraft with a specific airline, and you've got a guaranteed job with an airline. In this video, I'm going to explain why it might not seem as simple as that. The reality might be a little bit different. If you stick around to the end of the video, I'll also explain maybe where the alternative routes might lead you, so that way you've got a general picture of the broad spectrum of your routes into the industry as a pilot. Now, first of all, who am I? I have been a commercial pilot for the past 3 years. I've been through all of the hardships, all of the turmoil of COVID whilst I was doing my training. I've seen a number of guys go through cadet programs. So first and foremost, what is an airline sponsorship program? An airline sponsorship program is essentially an airline funding or partially funding your training, or bonding you to their contract from the start of your training till the end of your training, where they have the prospect of taking you upon their wings and hiring you as a first officer fresh out of training. Now, yeah, there's not many airlines that do that, and I'm specifically talking to the UK audience. If you want a video about the US market, which I've done extensive research into as well, please feel free to drop a comment and I'll do my best to make a video regarding that. But this is specific to the UK audience. Now, there are a number of airlines at the moment doing these sponsored programs like British Airways, TUI, but are they always what they work out to be? They're highly competitive programs where thousands and thousands of people apply for only hundreds of places. TUI can get over 10,000 applicants for just 60 positions, which can show you the drastic competitiveness of that particular program in itself. And of course, they're incredibly well advertised, and there is reason for those high number of applications, and it's because ultimately you're saving yourself potentially £100,000 of debt by going through a cadet program. But then when you look at the odds, is the likelihood that you're going to be that one chosen person out of however many thousands of people that are taking it deadly serious, that are working their absolute butts off to get to that role of 60 people, are you going to really be that person selected? I mean, it is almost a bit of a gamble to some degree. But who's not going to take the gamble? Who's not going to at least try to get that position? I mean, if I had the option when I started my training of potentially avoiding any possibility of taking out a loan and just going straight into a cadet program, I would 100% go for that route. But that being said, I didn't have that option. So I took an alternative option, which was go through an integrated course, which I had to fork out £100,000 for. Now, how I think about that is that despite knowing I might not get in for free, I was still willing to take that massive financial sacrifice in order to get to my goal of becoming a pilot. And I think that is the key that people miss. People are often trying to put the entirety of their eggs into one basket, which is going to be that fully sponsored program. So they're going to be waiting for years and years. Any opportunity they get to get into a sponsored program, or anytime the application's open, they're just going to quickly apply for that application and hope that they get it. But again, the more that these applications open and the more interest that they gain through the opening of their applications, because each year more and more applicants are applying for these programs, and the harder it's going to become. So ultimately, if you are in the position where you're thinking, all I'm going to do is just wait for the next sponsored program, and then I'm going to wait for the next sponsored program if I don't get into that, and then I'm going to wait for the next sponsored program if I don't get into that one. If you're in that mentality and that basket of people, what you might not understand is that maybe you will never get into one of those sponsored programs because the odds are absolutely insane. Sometimes it doesn't even matter what level you're at in terms of your academic ability and your IQ and everything, because ultimately you could slip up in one little phrase in your CV or one little phrase in the online application stage, or someone might have performed just 1% better than you on a specific online assessment, and then all of a sudden your chances of becoming a pilot have just been reduced to nothing. And what you have to realize is that maybe you have to have in your head that even if I can't get onto a sponsored program, I still want to become a pilot. There are so many routes out there and so many alternatives to take in order to get to your goal of becoming a pilot. So don't necessarily put all your eggs in one basket. Now, that being said as well, there are a number of downsides to the cadet program. One of the downsides is that you potentially got really long wait times to actually get into the airline, because you might finish in the peak of summer where they're not necessarily going to be starting their line training and type rating courses. So you might be waiting about 3-4 months to actually start with your start date at that specific airline, which is completely out of your control. On top of that, they have very strict timelines. So for example, if you had a family emergency and then that meant you had to miss an exam or you had to miss a medical, of course there may be leeway, but for some cadet programs, there's no leeway because they have a requirement to finish you by a certain date. And if you miss those medical exams or those theory exams, then you're going to go past that date and you're all of a sudden devoid to them. And then you get untagged by the airline because you're no longer going to meet the requirements of the finish date. On top of that, most of the courses give you very limited control as to how you're going to train or where you're going to do your training, because most of the time they work with partner flight schools, and those flight schools have a specific timeline and plan and schedule for you as an individual. So if you all of a sudden want to do your training in a different place or you want to be a bit closer to home, that might not necessarily work for the flight school, and therefore you have very limited control as to how you perform your training because you're in the hands of that airline and flight school who are going to basically try and get you through your training with a specific curriculum. Now, another potential problem for some is that you won't necessarily get a frozen ATPL license, which means you won't get the full license of an airline transport pilot license. But what you will get instead is an MPL license, which is a multi-crew pilot license. And that essentially means you're tagged to that airline until 1,500 hours, where you can then obtain an ATPL license. But before that point, you are entirely in the hands of the airline. So you have no freedom to leave whenever you wanted, and you are basically tagged to that airline. So if, for example, that airline decides to go bankrupt or decides to make all their pilots redundant, you are basically going to have no license to your name. So there is that threat. So you have to make sure that you go with an MPL program that is with a reputable airline that you know is going to last for at least the duration of 1,500 hours worth of flight time. And that equates to about 3 years of flying. So as long as you know that that particular MPL program and that particular airline that you're applying to is going to last for the next 5 years, I would say that you're in a safe position. But that being said, there's no guarantees. And even within your training, there isn't necessarily a guarantee of employment at the end. I remember I was training during COVID and I had a number of friends of mine who were on an MPL program. And as soon as COVID hit and that airline started making loads of their pilots redundant, what happened? The tagged airline sponsored guys actually also became untagged. And they were all MPL pilots. So like I said, the license they were applying for before is no longer recognized now because that airline doesn't need them. So all of their hours and all of the money that they had put into the training before that point was no longer usable for them. Some of the guys even just decided, okay, well, now I've got no choice but to just leave the career, leave the industry, go back to what I was doing before. A lot of the guys thankfully stuck it out. And because we were in a reputable flight school, which is another very, very important thing to make sure you consider before you start flying. But that being said, they were in that flight school with me and it was a reputable flight school. So what they did instead was they took those cadets on the MPL program and they offered them the opportunity to transfer over to an integrated program at the slight extra cost that I was paying, because obviously the airline was partially bonding them and was helping with the sponsored side of things before. Now they had to take on that financial burden. So that is potentially another thing to consider if you're worried that there may be another COVID or something else that might happen and potentially ruin your chances of getting to the employment stage. Then you need to consider that. Maybe you need some more flexibility in your pilot pathway so that if there is something that was to happen, then at least you can fall back on the license that you've already got and then apply for somewhere else. because with an MPL program, you can't necessarily do that. You're stuck and tied to that airline. Another aspect of a sponsored program, and specifically the MPL program, is that you won't necessarily get as much flight time as someone on a frozen ATPL program, because the MPL program is essentially just a fast track from your position with 0 hours to the right hand seat of potentially an A320. So it's an expedited route. But that being said, you don't necessarily do everything from start to finish, like the IR, the CPL. You wouldn't do all of those things. You'd essentially just be doing basic flying up until the point where you can then do a type rating. And then from the type rating, you go on to the airline and do line training and base training and everything else to be acclimatized to the airline life. From the start of your training, you're very much in the hands of the airline. So you have to keep that in mind, that you apply for an MPL program with a reputable airline. Now, another downside to sponsored programs is that your salary is going to be significantly impacted with a sponsored program. Ultimately, despite the fact that they are advertised as sponsored, you are going to be paying for it in the long run. For example, with some of the cadet programs recently, when you finish your training, you're basically bonded with that airline for 5 years at a massively reduced salary. And when I was working it out, it was about £20,000 off your salary for about 5 years. So it works to about £100,000 anyway. So as much as it is advertised as a sponsored program, you are essentially paying for it through your salary when you finish. So yeah, for me, that's essentially like taking out a loan anyway. Obviously, you're not going to be paying interest and anything else on top of it. So there is an advantage in that regard, but you are going to be tagged to that airline at a reduced salary. Whereas someone else, for example, who did an integrated course and paid £100,000 up front, they might stay at a particular airline for a year or two and then decide to switch and get paid potentially up to £80,000-90,000 and then ultimately pay off their loans quicker as well. So it's one of those things you have to balance out. Maybe you don't have the finances up front to begin with, or you can't get the loans out to begin with, so your only option is to go through a sponsored route. But just bear in mind, it's almost the same, and you are going to be essentially paying it back with regards to the training and everything else when you start working. But now I've drilled in loads of negatives and I've talked about the doom and gloom of a sponsored program. Ultimately, like I said earlier, if it was offered to me, I would 1,000,000% take it with open arms back when I was starting out. I think the most important thing you need to consider is, are you going to be happy with rejection? Because a lot of people go into a sponsored program and, like I said, they put all their eggs in that basket. If you're going to be comfortable that you may be rejected on this sponsored program because the amount of applicants is just insane, then yeah, by all means, I think a sponsored program would be worth trying. But always have in your mind there's a backup plan. Always have in your mind that I have an option of this sponsored program, but I also have the option of doing it integrated, doing it modular, doing it through a different route, because I know my end goal is to become a pilot no matter what it takes. So if you were rejected, then you've still got the options available to you. You've still got something else that you can pursue, another pathway that you can go through. So ultimately, you need to think to yourself, there's other routes, and have a plan B, have a plan C, because this isn't the only way into the industry, as much as people might limit themselves into believing that. Another thing to consider is that you're going to be competing with guys with a high academic score, high level of pilot competencies. So you need to also work on those within yourself. Make sure that you really understand what it takes to become a pilot. You understand how to be a good leader, how to have good communication skills, how to work in a team. Those things are so important when applying to a cadet program, because they're all going to be assessed on all of those things. They want to hire the people that are going to tick all of those pilot competency boxes. So you need to work on those as much as you physically can. You also need to understand that there may be a lack of flexibility on the airline's part. So you need to be very adaptable and be able to shape yourself into being suitable for them as an airline. So make sure that you are prepared to adjust your lifestyle to suit the pilot program, and make sure you're comfortable with the lack of flexibility of the program. For example, if they send you to Florida, then you have to be okay with going to Florida. So make sure you're aware of all of the requirements, the entire structure of their specific pathway, so that you're comfortable with everything that you're going to have to do in the long run. Because you might get onto the cadet program, but then you might not necessarily be able to go to Florida because your visa doesn't allow you to, or you might not be able to leave your family because someone at home needs you. Those things you need to really, really consider before you decide to put all of your eggs in the basket of a cadet program. Also, make sure that you've actually experienced what a flight might be like. I think it's really, really important before you sit any assessment or exam that you know what you're going to basically be getting yourself in for. If you've never done a trial flight or you've never done any sim session or had any experience, I'd recommend doing some. I mean, flying a sim at home is very different from flying an aircraft in reality. Also, be comfortable with doing loads of research into case studies, loads of research into the aviation industry as a general whole. And of course, if you need help with any of that, any help building your pilot competencies, becoming a better leader, better communicator, becoming more aware of the industry as a whole, then that's something that I can offer. If you go into the description, you can book a call with me and we can discuss how I may be able to work with you towards bettering your chances at not specifically a sponsored program, but any program that you may be looking to apply for, or any airline that you're looking to apply for. We can work together to make sure that that is something that you're going to be comfortable with. And I personally will be there to guide you and help you along your pathway to make sure that you are a very desirable applicant to any specific pilot assessment or program. Not only that, I'll be fully committed from start to finish to helping get through your training. Now, what are the alternatives to a sponsored program? Well, we have two other alternatives. The two alternatives are integrated and modular pathways. Now, I've done a very extensive video on that. I'll attach it here as well in the top corner. What it might do is help build you a picture of how you can get into the industry aside from a cadet program, because there are other ways of getting into the industry. You do not necessarily have to put the entirety of your eggs into the basket of a cadet program. I may be absolutely drilling in all of the negatives, but it is a fantastic opportunity to take a cadet program, and if you do get lucky enough to get through it, and then absolutely, why wouldn't you take it? But the important factor for me to drill into you guys is that there are other options out there, and you don't necessarily have to just say, I'm only going to try for sponsored programs, when in reality, there's so many pathways into the industry, and that's something that I would love to help you guys out with. So yeah, feel free to book in a call and we'll do that. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope that has given you some insight and extra motivation if you haven't made it through any cadet programs, that there is always a route and a pathway to get into the industry. It does not necessarily stop at, oh, I've been rejected for this cadet program, so I'm never going to make it. You can always make it as a pilot, no matter what stage you're at in life, no matter where you are in your background, you can definitely make it. I've proven it through my story. So please, if you are in that position where you're doubtful of whether or not I'm going to make it, don't be doubtful. You will be able to get there in the end. You just have to keep motivated, keep passionate, keep up to date with my videos, because I'll be able to help you and give you more guidance. And like I said, I give this information to you guys to help you on your journey. If you could do me a favor and help me by just liking this video, subscribing to my channel so that we can reach as many people as we physically can, and that way we can help out as many people who are dreaming to become a pilot as physically possible. Thank you very much for listening, and I hopefully see you very, very soon.